So this is a talk I gave back in September 2014 at the Festival of the Mind, which is a fantastic festival organised by the University of Sheffield in partnership with Sheffield City Council. And it was a talk I gave actually in a disused department store right in the centre of town to a really fascinating audience as part of a set of sessions to do with languages in the world. And my particular focus comes from my research on languages, poetry and music. And the question that I often ask myself in my teaching at the university and in my research, which is of course something that informs my teaching all the time, is what happens when we sing in French and how does it change things? And I kind of want to share with you a lot of the different approaches to this idea of what singing in French does for you. So when you talk about singing in French, you might think of famous singers who are French, such as Edith Piaf, or who sing in French, such as Jacques Brel, depicted on the slides in the black and white images. But of course, singing in French can just as well be done by anybody. And I do quite a lot of work with professional singers, such as Sophie Bevan, who's pictured in the middle of this slide, but also some of my students, and these are undergraduate students at the university who are not specialist singers. They're not doing a music degree, they're doing a French degree, and we look at why singing in French can really help you with your language learning and your general cultural knowledge. I think the two can't be separated. What I want to kind of bring into the equation is how singing in French can also be related to working with particular texts and particular really famous texts. And my research comes from the background of 19th century French poetry. I've always had a passion for that, and it's a really important thing for me. And the poet I work on most is called Charles Baudelaire, one of the most famous French poets ever. And I can't help but be drawn to him, in part because of what he tells us about the relationship between poetry and music. But it turns out that a lot of people have set his poetry to music, and therefore a lot of singers have recorded those song settings. They're quite well-known classical settings of his music, for example, but also pop music artists have taken Baudelaire's poetry and set it to music. And I think it's a really, really important kind of mixture that we have this famous canonical poet, we have some really important classical music settings that continue to be performed today, and we have pop artists wanting to work with his poetry. And I think that has a really important implication for the wider public about what famous poetry can do and where it can take us. And I just thought it was useful to share with you a really interesting quote from Mylène Farmer, a French singer in the 1980s, who talked about why she chose to set a particular Baudelaire poem to music. The poem is called L'Horloge, the clock. And she says the reason she chose it was because partly there was something to do with the notion of time in that poem. That's what she says. C'est parce que la notion du temps qui passe ne me laisse pas indifférente. But also, and it's this final kind of bit of the quote that you can see at the bottom of your slide there, Baudelaire has an incredible writing style. And that's the kind of the attraction for me of Baudelaire. And I hope to share a little bit of that with you too. So what I want to do is just take you through a miniature case study of the most famous poem of Baudelaire in terms of how it's been set to music. And I'm starting with something that's perhaps most familiar to you all. Many of you might have come across the series, in fact, of Louis Vuitton adverts, which are called L'invitation voyage. There's been a few of them quite recently, and they don't directly quote Baudelaire, they don't pick up on any of the music that has come from his poem, but this title, L'Invitation Voyage, this idea of travelling somewhere, going on a journey, has attracted, obviously, luxury goods advertisers as much as it has other composers and artists and singers. So let's have a little look at what this poem is. I'm just putting up on the screen the first main stanza of the poem. There are three big stanzas of the poem, and there's a little refrain, which is this two-line refrain, which I've quoted at the bottom of the screen there. Now, what's interesting is that if you ask me what the poem is sort of doing or telling or what it's about, although I kind of resist that a little bit, it's talking of the idea of the poet and his lover travelling on a journey to some unknown foreign land to live out their days in kind of perfect luxury, perfect harmony, if you like. And that's what the refrain does. It says, là, tout n'est qu'ordre et beauté, luxe, calme et volupté. This idea of it being just the ideal place for them to live together. But it's not without its kind of questions. It's fraught a little bit with the imperfections underlying or underpinning the whole text. And what surprises me with this poem is why it's attracted so much attention, because it's a really rare setup, a really rare format for Baudelaire. Baudelaire often writes in the really famous French verse line. So French is syllabic in its poetry, where English, for example, is accentual. And I often describe that as saying how in English you can fit lots of words into the same kind of pulse, whereas in French you've got a fixed number of kind of sounds that you can fit in. So where French is just equally weighted syllables, English can fit lots of words in. Now, the hallowed, famous traditional line that is most often revered in French poetry is known as the Alexandrine, and that's 12 syllables long. So you'll hear something like La nature est un temple où de vivants piliers laissent parfois sortir de confuses paroles. And I've given you there 2 lines of another famous Baudelaire poem, Correspondance. And I've deliberately spoken it in really even kind of syllables. Whereas in English you might hear something, I always quote T.S. Eliot's Cats, the Skimbleshanks poem. There's a whisper down the line at 11:39 when the night mill's ready to depart. This kind of idea of fitting lots of words into the same pulse, whereas French poetry is really even. And why is that useful for understanding L'Invitation au voyage? Well, it's because this poem actually doesn't use the 12-syllable line. It hints at it but doesn't use it. And more to the point, it chooses line lengths of 5 syllables and 7 syllables and mixes them up a little bit. Now, the mathematically astute amongst you will notice that, of course, 5 plus 7 equals 12. So that's why I'm saying it sort of plays around with the famous traditional verse metre of 12 syllables. But it doesn't allow it to just be that. So we've got an unusual metre of 5 and 7 syllables in a sort of a pattern, but also we have a very unusual thing that there is a refrain in this poem. Very, very few of Baudelaire's poems are structured like this, a verse and then a refrain. So something's happening here that's starting to hint at the idea that it might be more like a song than a poem, that it might be more musically inclined than otherwise. There's lots of problems with that idea too, because the poem, although I've only given you one stanza here, if you look up the whole poem through the links at the bottom there, the whole poem doesn't reference music once. So it's only perhaps in its form or format that maybe it references music. So something interesting is happening. But I said at the beginning that this is one of the most famous poems of Baudelaire. Well, it is. I've just listed here some of the song settings of this poem, L'Invitation au voyage. There are loads more. I've just picked out some of the really, really interesting ones. And what is interesting, first of all, is that the earliest one at the bottom of your screen there, by Jules Cressonnieu, happened during Baudelaire's lifetime. Baudelaire didn't die until 1867. Now, we don't know for sure that Baudelaire heard the Cressonnieu setting, but we know that he knew about it. But the one that is the most famous, that if you go to any classical song recital, that's got French music on it, you're highly likely to hear this Duparc setting, Henri Duparc. It's a beautiful, luscious setting. There's really, really kind of extended phrases. And it's interesting, that happened just a few years after Baudelaire's death. We've got the Cressonnieu and then the Duparc doing something quite close to Baudelaire's time, but doing something completely different. The Cressonnieu setting is really, really formulaic. It's straightforward. It's kind of cha-cha kind of rhythm, and really has to kind of slightly mangle the poetic text to make it work to the music. And Cressonnieu was a military band composer, so he wasn't this kind of grand original musical ideas kind of guy, but he was really accomplished, but straightforward music. Whereas Duparc was developing a whole new genre of music that didn't exist before. He was developing this idea of the French mélodie that that this is more kind of highbrow, more extended art song. So he makes really big demands of the singer and the pianist in that setting. But then there are loads more. There's Léo Ferré, who did an anniversary setting of Les Fleurs du Mal. It's really, really well known, particularly in France. And then there are other ones like the Jacques Ivard one. He's brilliant. It's a real kind of singer-songwriter, just get your guitar out, sing it like you'd speak it. It's definitely got a melody, but it's pronounced how you'd speak it, really. And then far more extravagantly, you've got Marc-Antoine Turnage's most recent one, which makes major demands of a soprano, really, really kind of high range or wide range and sort of more, I wouldn't say screechy noises, but kind of really demanding, both of the singer and of the listener, with more orchestral accompaniment behind it. So that just gives you a flavour of this poem, which has inspired luxury good adverts and a completely diverse set of song settings, from basic songs of the 19th century through to kind of major works with kind of orchestra backing via singer-songwriters along the way. But why am I interested in this? Well, it gives us kind of a pathway to analyse and examine what you might do when you want to go about singing in French. So having said, for example, that L'Invitation Voyage is really famous, let's say a non-native speaker of French wants to go about singing the poem. Well, they might have a go at reading it in French, starting with the poem. And this is often what's advocated by teachers at conservatoires or music schools, for example. And particularly in France, that's the big idea. Start with the poem, get to know the poem. So you read it in French to establish the sounds, the stresses, the intonation, where it might go up or down. And then for those who are non-native, you might then turn to an English translation, or a translation in another language, of course, to find out the meaning of individual words. So where a word is sung, what does that word mean at that point in time? Is it important or not important? As well as to get, of course, an overall sense of the poem. And then, from having read the poem, having worked out what it meant, you get into the context of actually singing it. You're combining all of those ideas, all of that kind of background research, that background preparation that you've had to do to get you then singing in French. But I've got a question there at the bottom, because I wonder if that's enough to go from reading the poem, checking the translation, to then delivering it. It's what a lot of singers do. And perhaps it's worth me just spending a couple of minutes talking about this idea of an English translation, because I'm not saying what you're doing is looking for a translation that you can then sing in translation. That's a whole other area which is very important, but I'm not going to talk about today. And we can critique. I had to translate a translation up on the screen earlier of L'Invitation Voyage. It's one that I've kind of worked up a little bit myself. I'm not looking at translation as this idea of kind of word for word perfection. I don't think translation generates perfection. So I'm not also looking for kind of errors in it. But I'm looking for this idea of translation being a modification, a mode of changing the text into something slightly different, something that you can work with in a slightly different way, that gives you another angle, another way in to the text. So that's my kind of idea of what translation might do for us in this context. But I said, is starting with the poem enough? I'm going to flip it and look at the idea that you might start with the song and go back to the poem. And if you're working with something that has a long history that's already been recorded, you can start with a recording of the song. You can pick up the Léo Ferré recording, for example, and listen to that. And then from that, by copying the sounds, if you've heard it enough times, you can start to sing in French. You can pick up the melody, copy the sounds, and then you can work backwards to find out what it means, to then enable you to maybe read in French with correct sounds, correct stresses, correct intonation. And for me, perhaps that gives you some kind of added bonus. I'm not saying that there is only one way of doing it, but I'm saying that too often we start with that, I've got to read it, I've got to get the translation, and only then, once I know everything, can I sing it. I want to give us that freedom to start, just listen and sing, just go for it, just be a bit more relaxed about it. And in fact, there's a whole body of resources for singing in French and using songs to specifically help you learn languages. And There's numerous websites I've popped up on the slides here which will help you. Gives you kind of roots in, and some of these are by really famous poets that have been set to music, and some of them are just childhood songs, nursery rhymes. There's all sorts of choice there. And I think it's a really important thing that often gets overlooked. And it's not just a thing for primary school children to do. This is for people to do right the way throughout their lives. I think that's a really important thing. Now, what I do with languages and singing is actually I work most often with professional singers. So these are people who have, for example, gone to music college, for example, the Royal College of Music or the Royal Academy of Music. And they're often at the very early stages of their careers, having to present professional recitals to paying audiences. And so, for example, I've worked with the absolutely amazing and wonderful and really lovely soprano Sophie Bevan, who is gracing the Opera House stages as we speak. And she and I have worked quite closely together on how she sings in French and how she goes about pronouncing the French text. But more to the point, it's not just this, oh, I can pronounce it right, or the sound is correct for that particular vowel sound. But it's also about really close work with the interpretation of the poem and the music. So it's not that there is one way you should interpret the poem, but you're working with something a bit more hybrid. You've got the composer's interpretation already. You've got this other layer of music, which is telling you something about the particular text. So we work really, really closely. We've done masterclasses together. We've done one-on-one language coaching together. But all the time we're heading towards this idea of interpretation. And, you know, the stuff I've worked with is, for Sophie, we've done stuff with students at the university, with members of the public, hosts at the university. But then she's gone on with that training that we've kind of worked on together to perform it live on Radio 3, for example. She did the Berlioz Nuit d'été, for those of you who know those wonderful settings of Théophile Gautier's poems. And so often I've had this idea that, oh, I know it all, I'm going to help Sophie. It's not that at all. It's every time I work with someone like Sophie, I'm getting a new perspective on the poem. I'm getting a new perspective on the song. I'm learning something fresh about the sounds of French and how you might pronounce it a different way, put a different colour, a different timbre on it, and it makes it sarcastic, or it makes it really romantic or really tender. And we work really, really carefully on the precise sounds that you want, not just so that it's accurate French, but so that it is also selling the story of that particular poem for that particular performance in that particular context. I suppose you might ask, where does singing in another language take us? Well, for Sophie, it takes her into her professional career as an opera singer. But for others of us, it takes us to lots of different places. It can take us into more confident speakers of a language. If you're confident making the sounds because you've heard them and you're copying them, and you're feeling the rhythms of the language as well, that can make you more confident user of the language. But what's helpful to kind of have in our minds is something that Baudelaire himself tells us. Even in this poem, which doesn't reference music at all or doesn't reference singing, he has this idea of going somewhere, going on this journey, and he doesn't specify where it is. He says in French, aller là-bas, to live together, to go to that place, là-bas, there. It's not specified. And lots of people who've tried to interpret this poem come up with really interesting ideas. Some say it's about going to somewhere in the Netherlands, because he mentions in one of the stanzas, he mentions canals. But other people interpret this as Baudelaire talking about going to the Far East, because he mentions the Oriental splendours, for example. And these are all really valid interpretations of the poem. They're really useful. They help us to picture things in a different way. But for me, this idea that Baudelaire hasn't specified it, this kind of aller là-bas, think of the rapture, think of the joyousness of going to this place and living there together, because you're finding something new out. That's, for me, what excites me about working with French poetry sung, of singing in another language, because it can take us to an unknown place, take us on a journey that we can't be sure of. So I'd like to finish by suggesting that singing in French it's a real game changer. And I suppose singing in any languages, but my specialism is from the domain of French, and starting with really famous French poetry. And it's a game changer, not because it makes opera more accessible, for example, although that can be an important element. It's a real game changer because your whole perspective on the language changes. You go to this other place, live in this other world, or inhabit this other world where you are not just someone who speaks English, who has an ability to try out languages, but someone who really inhabits that other language so well that you can sing in it. And I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about singing in French and whether it really is a game changer for you too. Thank you very much.